Let's say there's a 32-year-old patient who is admitted to the hospital with hypoxic COVID pneumonia, and his clinical status declines to the point where he needs ECMO. ECMO stands for extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, okay? And it's basically a heart-lung machine. Now, ECMO is only offered in 264 hospitals in the US. It's expensive, and there's an inadequate supply of staff required to maintain it. Okay. So, because of those reasons, ECMO primarily serves as a bridge to support sick patients until they can receive an organ transplant. This particular patient needed a bilateral lung transplant, but he was deemed not to be a candidate because of his poor potential for recovery and a lack of family and friends to provide post transplant support. This means that for him, ECMO would not be a bridge, right? Like this guy is just dependent on ECMO, and if they disconnect him from the machine, he's just going to die, right? So this means that he would have to stay in the hospital. Now, another key point to note is that this guy was awake, okay? And he could talk and he had decision-making capacity, okay? And he wanted to continue living. So you have a guy who is not a candidate for a transplant, right? So he's just stuck on this machine forever, right? Or until he passes, right? This machine is expensive and other people need to use it, right? And other people who would have a better outcome if they were to receive it. And this patient doesn't want to die. So this case brings up a couple of things, right? The first thing is futility, right? So futility basically means that this particular treatment is not going to achieve the outcome that you want, okay? And I think a lot of people, when they hear a case like this, think about futility, right? And I just want to caution people from referring to futility to justify withdrawing treatment. I would say futility has three components, okay? One component is that there is a goal, okay? The other component is that there is a treatment. And the third is this inability for this treatment to attain that goal, okay? So whether or not something is futile is dependent on what goal we're talking about, right? So perhaps a hospital's goal is for this person to survive discharge, right? If that's the goal, then yeah, ECMO would be futile, right? But for the patient, his goal might just be to continue living, right? If that's the goal, then ECMO is not futile. So the other thing I want to bring up is justice, okay? So justice often revolves around these wide-scale resource allocation issues, and this is one of those. So in this case, you have a scarce resource, right, in which the demand exceeds the supply, right? More people are going to need ECMO than we have machines. So in those cases, how do we prioritize? Who gets the machine? So one of the ethical principles of resource allocation is that you want to maximize benefit. You want to do the most good, all right? So this ethical principle of maximizing benefits justifies prioritizing some people over others. Okay. Now, the question is, what does that mean in this case? Does that mean that the hospital can unilaterally withdraw? Right? Again, keep in mind that this patient wants to continue living, right? He wants to survive. He wants the machine. So there is a distinction that some people like to make between withholding and withdrawing treatment. And the reason why some people want to make that distinction is because it feels different, right? Like if this person's already attached to a machine and you unplug him, right, then it feels like you're killing him versus him not having received the machine to begin with, right? In that case, you're almost like letting him die, right? Like his disease is killing him. Whereas if you start treatment and then stop it, you're killing him. Right? A lot of people feel that way. So the standard bioethical position is that there's no ethical difference between withholding and withdrawing. Okay, so in cases where you are justified in withholding treatment, you're also justified in withdrawing treatment. So in this case, the question to ask is whether or not it would have been justified to withhold ECMO from this person, given what we know, right? So let's say this person needed a bilateral lung transplant but wasn't a candidate, right? So ECMO would not have been a bridge. Would it have been justified for us to withhold ECMO from him, right? If the answer is yes, then the answer for withdrawal should also be yes. So here's one reason to think why there's no ethical difference between withholding and withdrawing. Let's imagine two scenarios, okay? In both scenarios, you have two patients, right? Patient A and patient B. Now let's say that patient B is actually a better candidate because patient B is expected to have better health outcomes. In scenario one, patient A arrives at the hospital first. Okay, so patient A receives a scarce resource. Patient B arrives a few days later. Okay, so then the question of withdrawing comes up. In the second scenario, patient A and patient B arrive at the hospital at the same time. right? In that scenario, you give patient B the resource because, again, he's expected to have better health outcomes, right? So what differs between withholding the treatment from patient A in the second scenario and withdrawing the treatment from patient A in the first scenario is time, right? The only difference is that patient A arrived at the hospital first. And so one reason to think why that shouldn't matter is called the principle of temporal neutrality, okay? Which states that the timing of an event cannot by itself be a morally relevant factor, right? When something occurs does not make a moral difference. Whether a patient presents to a hospital earlier is not a morally relevant characteristic, right? So that's a reason to think why there's no difference between withholding and withdrawing. All right, so going back to the case, now you may think that the person not wanting to die morally matters, okay? And I would say, yes, it does morally matter, okay? But in a situation where you're thinking about whether or not to withhold the treatment from him, that equally matters. So in either case, whether we're talking about withholding or withdrawing, we can reasonably assume that the patient doesn't want to die, right? That the patient wants ECMO, okay? So that is not going to determine whether or not he gets it. The people who are withheld treatment from usually want treatment, right? So that in itself is not going to make the difference. All right, well, I'm going to end it here. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you all next time.